afternoon. We're right at time, and I only know we have an hour for this robust discussion, so I want to take advantage of all of it. Thank you so much for joining us for our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion virtual dialogue on equity, justice, and politics. As you know, this is a historic electoral week and a really intense one, so we're hoping we can engage in dialogue with experts in the field. I'm so excited to welcome Professor Traustein here from UC Merced and Professor Jones from Rutgers Newark, who I also didn't share. I'm from New Jersey, so that's another sort of cool point. But I will turn it over to our graduate student researchers, Hala and Maria, to make formal introductions. I know that Onar is going to share a link in the chat box of other events happening during this week that I encourage you to tap into. And again, thank you for engaging with us. Thank you for being with us. And thank you for always supporting this work.
So hello everyone, my name is Maria and I'm one of Associate Chancellor Matos' graduate student researchers. And I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Traustein today. So Dr. Traustein earned her PhD in political science from UC San Diego in 2004, and she now serves as the Foundational Board of Trustees Presidential Chair of Political Sciences at UC Merced. Before joining UC Merced in 2009, Dr. Traustein served as the Assistant Professor of Politics and Public Policy at Princeton University. She's the author of 19 peer-reviewed articles, 6 book chapters, and 2 award-winning books, the first of which is called Segregation by Design, Local Politics and Inequality in American Cities, and the second is called Political Monopolies in American Cities, The Rise and Fall of Bosses and Reformers. Professor Traustein's work studies the processes and quality of representation in American democracy. She is focused on the ways in which formal and informal local political institutions generate inequalities. Professor Traustein's scholarship is mixed method. It relies on historical analysis, case studies, experiments, and large and qualitative analyses. She has served as the consultant for the U.S. Department of Justice, city governments, and various other community organizations, and serves on numerous editorial and foundation boards. As the fourth political scientist hired at UC Merced, Professor Traustein has played a critical role in helping to build the university. So now I'll turn it over to my colleague Hala to introduce Dr. Jones.
Hi everyone, my name is Hala Alnajar. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology and graduate student researcher in the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And I'd like to introduce Dr. James R. Jones, fellow sociologist. Dr. Jones is an assistant professor of African American Studies and Sociology at Rutgers University, Newark. He received his PhD in sociology from Columbia University in 2017, and his research investigates representation and inequality inside of American democratic institutions. He studies the experiences of Black government workers as a way to understand the complicated relationship between race, power, and inequality in state institutions. He's currently completing his first book, The Last Plantation, which represents the first major study of racial inequality in the congressional workplace. The title draws on the fact that members of Congress and their staff have applied this telling nickname to the legislature in order to highlight how the institution is exempt from the very policies and principles it is tasked to create and implement, including federal workplace laws. In The Last Plantation, Dr. Jones draws upon the plantation metaphor to analyze the racial constituents of Congress and examine how race and racism are produced and maintained within the congressional workplace and the Capitol at large. This manuscript is adapted from his doctoral dissertation, which won the Robert K. Merton Award for Best Dissertation from the Department of Sociology at Columbia University. Dr. Jones is a leading expert on congressional staff diversity. He has authored 2 groundbreaking policy reports on racial representation among congressional staff. His research demonstrates that racial minorities are underrepresented in both top and junior staff positions on Capitol Hill. His recently published The Color of Congress with Pay Our Interns, which documents how white students dominate congressional internships. His first public policy documented the underrepresentation of racial minorities in top staff positions in the Senate for the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. The report garnered widespread news coverage, including exclusives with The Atlantic and The Washington Post. In 2017, Senate Minority Leader Charles Schumer adopted policy recommendations from the report to increase racial diversity amongst Democratic staff and improve transparency in staff decisions. Dr. Jones's research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Dirksen Congressional Center, Columbia University, Duke University, and Princeton University. And so now I'll turn it over to our two esteemed panelists to lead us in today's discussion.
Thank you, Hala. Just right before that, I wanted to share the format. Professor Traustein is going to present, and then Professor Jones. If you're like me and you forget something, feel free to put your question in the chat, and then we will get to some robust discussion in a Q&A. Pardon the interruption. Go ahead, Professor Traustein.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here and for the invitation to share my work with you. Everybody's thinking a lot, probably constantly, about what's going to happen tomorrow, and I'm not going to tell you the answer to that. So sorry, but we can talk about it in the chat afterward. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start back in time a little bit. So I'm going to try to share my screen and hope that we do not have technical difficulties. And I'm sure you'll all let me know if I do have technical difficulties. I'm going to start here. Okay, so I'm going to assume that everything looks good to you. Yeah, everything looks good. Okay, great. So I want to start off by sort of giving you a bigger picture about how anti-Blackness is embedded in our politics in the United States. So anti-Blackness is literally embedded in the design of our communities and our political institutions. And when I talk about political institutions, what I mean are the rules and regulations that govern our political system. So any rule, any law, any piece of the government that you can think of that sort of dictates the ways in which politics works in the United States has race and racism embedded in it in some way. One example of these kinds of institutions is our land use regulations. And I recently completed a book where I studied how land use regulations dictate what gets built, where it gets built, what it looks like, and how race and racism is embedded in that process. So the book that I wrote, as you can see on this slide, is called Segregation by Design: Local Politics and Inequality in American Cities. And I worked with an artist, a man named Derek Ritter, to create a comic that explains how this process works. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit of the comic material and then explain the research as I go along. So the comic begins with you meeting a couple, Tom and Jen, and you can see that Jen is pregnant with baby Katie, and you should notice that Tom and Jen are white in this comic, and the sort of focus here is on this couple that is seeking to buy a home. So you New Jerseyites, you'll be excited to hear this. I was living in New Jersey when I started this book, and so this is where this comes from. But Tom and Jen are searching for a house in the city of Camden, New Jersey. And they have a long list of priorities, and you can sort of see in this little picture here on the right, they want their house to be under $110,000. I know, laughable in California, not so laughable in Camden, but they want the neighborhood to have low crime, they want good schools, they want an old home with charm, right? A long list of things that seem perfectly reasonable altogether. And this is their real estate agent, Linda. And Linda says that she's going to do her best to try to help this couple find a house. So Linda begins by showing Tom and Jen all these different properties, and each one she shows them, they find something wrong. Oh, this one's too noisy. This one has too much crime. This one is next door to a school that's not very good. And you'll notice Tom and Jen don't dislike any of the houses. That's not their complaint. The complaint that they make is larger than that. It's about the neighborhood. And so Linda gets sort of frustrated and says, well, have you thought about looking at homes outside of Camden? So next, they go to Cherry Hill. And for, again, people from New Jersey, you'll understand this comparison. Cherry Hill is a little suburb that basically neighbors Camden, but it has very different demographics. And I'm going to tell you about those demographics in a little bit. Tom wants to know why Cherry Hill looks so different from Camden. Right? You can't help but notice, he says, that all the white people live in Cherry Hill and all the Black residents live in Camden. And Camden has broken streets and overflowing sewers and difficulty paying their bills. And Cherry Hill has beautiful libraries, and they collect big monuments for their community, and it's a lovely place to live. And so Tom says, why is Cherry Hill so different from Camden? Is it just racism, he wonders, or that some people have more money? Maybe this is just about preferences, right? Maybe it's that the people in Camden want to live apart from the people in Cherry Hill. Well, research tells us that that's not correct. People of color mostly don't want segregation. Surveys tell us that most Black residents in the United States prefer to live in integrated communities, and it's actually white residents who prefer to live in more segregated communities. So in general, whites and people of color have very different views about what makes up an ideal neighborhood. And it's no surprise to any of you who are listening here that the people who make the rules about who gets to live where have tended to be historically white residents, not people of color. So Linda says, really, Tom, this isn't about individual choices. This is about politics. She goes on. It's the fact that local governments have institutionalized racism, building the design of racism into the cities themselves. Since the earliest days of the United States urban development, local governments have influenced property values and strategically allocated benefits like sewers or garbage collection to the benefit of white neighborhoods. Local politics is, at its core, about land use. And that land use process has been dominated by white property owners who have sought to enhance their wealth and control the allocation of services like public education. Through land use regulation, zoning, and redevelopment, local governments have created segregation along race and class lines. Linda goes on here. Sometimes this segregation that white property owners create gets threatened. Now, you've all heard of Brown v. Board of Education, right? You've all heard about the federal government coming in and saying, communities, you have to stop segregating your schools. Well, part of my research looks at what happens when the federal government makes those kinds of decisions. Well, it turns out that white residents simply change their pattern of segregation. I'm going to explain more about this in just a minute, but when the federal government passes fair housing laws, demands school integration, or even when Black mayors begin winning election to office in a variety of cities throughout the United States, white property owners changed the scale of segregation. I'm going to show you some maps so that we can try to get on the same page and I can tell you what I'm talking about here. So here is a map of Camden, New Jersey in 1940. And the darker shaded neighborhoods here are places where more Black residents lived. You can see that in 1940, Camden is very diverse. It has a lot of neighborhoods that have a heavy Black population. They have a lot of neighborhoods that have sort of a moderately large Black population. And they have a lot of neighborhoods where there's a very white population. Okay? So we call this neighborhood level segregation. Each neighborhood looks different from the one next to it, right? That's how we can define segregation. Now, I want to fast forward 30 years, and now we're looking at a picture of Camden next door to Cherry Hill, that community that I introduced at the beginning. And you can see here on the left that the neighborhoods in Camden have become much more Black. They have become populated with many more Black residents, while Cherry Hill has remained almost exclusively white. This is the process by which segregation changes over time. But I want you to notice one thing in this picture. In Camden, at the very bottom of the picture and the very top of the picture, there are still exclusively white neighborhoods within the city of Camden. Now, fast forward to 2011 and look what has happened. All of the white neighborhoods in Camden have gone away. There are none. There are no white neighborhoods left in Camden. And there are many more people of color who live in Cherry Hill. And yet, the dominant way that segregation has occurred between neighborhoods now is between these two cities rather than within them. So Cherry Hill looks very different on the whole than Camden does. That is the place of segregation that we are at now. In the late 19th century, Blacks were just about as segregated as other ethnic and other immigrant groups. At the turn of the century, the Black population in the North began to expand, mostly for economic factors, but also for Black residents seeking to flee the Jim Crow South. As Black migration from the South increased, Northern whites became more and more aggressive about segregation. And Blacks were concentrated into a smaller and smaller number of neighborhoods with very high densities. In 1970, that type of segregation peaked. We saw very high levels of residential segregation in the United States. And immigrant enclaves, Chinatowns or Japantowns or Irish communities were never as homogenous as these Black neighborhoods were. Neighborhood segregation, though, begins to decline after the 1970s. And instead, what you see is the rise of this city-level segregation that I just showed you. So starting in the post-war period, but really taking off in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, segregation changed so that now we have stark, deep divisions between cities and their suburbs. This is a map of the Fresno area. So you can see Fresno sort of down at the bottom and Merced is up here at the top. I know it's tiny and I can post these slides if people want to see, but you can see that we have a fair amount of segregation here in the Central Valley as well. And if you look at that big line running through the center, you're all on mute, so you can't answer my Socratic questions here, but take a guess what that is. Yeah, that's the highway, right? So the highway runs down the center of these communities and divides communities in this way. But if I want you to notice though, down in the Fresno area, the city of Clovis looks pretty different than the city of Fresno. That's another example of a place where we have gone from having segregation within communities to segregation across communities. So here we are thinking about sort of the status of segregation today. Suburban populations have diversified, as I showed you in that map of Cherry Hill, particularly the suburbs that are closest to city centers. We call those inner ring suburbs. But as you can see from this table of data, suburbs are much whiter and have many fewer people of color than our central cities do. They have higher levels of poverty in our central cities have higher levels of poverty. Our central cities have more renters. Our central cities have much lower incomes and a smaller share of wealthy residents. What this means is that suburbs have all of the advantages on the socioeconomic dimensions that are important in sort of maintaining our lives. So you might ask, how have whites kept Blacks out of their neighborhoods? And I'm just going to describe a few of the strategies that whites have used. I don't want to take up too much more time, but I'll list some. So whites have kept Blacks out of their neighborhood through individual level processes. Violence, right? Literally just attacking people when they tried to move into the neighborhood was a very common strategy of maintaining the color line in the early 1900s. Racial steering started very early on and continues today, and that's where real estate agents choose not to show white home buyers houses in neighborhoods of color and vice versa. They won't show buyers of color houses that are available in white neighborhoods. On average, Black buyers are informed of between 25 and 50% fewer housing units by real estate agents. And that there have been many, many studies, mostly conducted by sociologists, that have shown that there is a significant bias, significant racism in the housing market. Also, whites have historically kept Blacks out of their neighborhoods by using restrictive covenants. This is a private statement that is written into the title of your house that says that you will not sell to certain groups. And whole neighborhoods would have restrictive covenants. And there's quite interesting research to be done here showing that restrictive covenants that existed in the early 1900s continue to be whiter neighborhoods today. But my research really looks at these governmental policies. And so in the end, these governmental policies can have the same sort of effects as restrictive covenants, racial steering, and violence can. You've probably all heard the term redlining. That is a phrase that comes out of a federal government practice, right? the federal government in trying to spur home ownership after the Great Depression was investing in home buyers and providing mortgages to people, except that they didn't want to take on risky mortgages. And so they rated neighborhoods as to whether or not they would be a good investment or a not good investment. And take a guess at what neighborhoods were the best investments. White neighborhoods were the best investments. And that's where the home buyers got mortgages that were backed by the federal government. Redlining refers to literally drawing a red line around neighborhoods of color. We also have a long history of slum clearance. The government federally funded but locally enacted clearing, literally tearing down communities of color to build other things, parking lots sometimes, shopping malls other times, and disrupting these communities of color, increasing segregation by sending those residents to other segregated neighborhoods. My research looks at these bottom two pieces of governmental policy: racial zoning and economic zoning. Racial zoning, you're wondering what that is. In the early 1900s, literally, cities just said, they took a map and drew pictures and said, this is the neighborhood where the Black residents are going to live, and this is the neighborhood where the white residents are going to live. And one of the things that I do in my book is try to trace, do those neighborhoods still look the same today? And they do, right? So simply putting that policy in practice in the early 1900s, even though it becomes illegal, it's no longer constitutionally protected to do that, to engage in zoning in that way, but there are persistent effects of this kind of behavior. More common today, though, is economic zoning, and that is simply preventing apartment buildings or multifamily homes from being built in a certain neighborhood, or not allowing renters in a particular community. These kinds of land use regulations change the racial makeup of the community. So here's where I'm going to sort of wrap it up. What are the consequences of these patterns for politics? Well, political geography is comprised of nested units. The neighborhoods that I've been talking about have their own elected representatives, but those elected representatives are not the only representatives, right? So they have neighborhood level representatives, and we have districts that are nested within cities, cities within states, and states, of course, within our nation. And when residential segregation maps onto political geography, our political divisions become fused with race and class divisions. This has two important consequences. The first is that segregation generates inequalities, vast inequalities in access to public resources. Segregation across city lines has meant that the government services that are experienced by racial and ethnic minorities and low-income individuals are inferior to the government services experienced by whites and the wealthy. Just think about public schools. Right? The schools that are experienced by white, wealthy school children are different than the schools that are experienced by poor residents and residents of color. And my research shows that residents of color also deal with more terrible events like sewer overflows, which is what you're looking at in this picture. Now I'm going to get to the election. Finally, here we are at the election today. All right, this is old data, but the data are based. They'll show the same thing once I get the data from this. From this election as well. Segregation also generates political polarization between communities. From the neighborhood's perspective, a segregated community is one that is whiter or blacker than it otherwise could be, right? So if you think from the neighborhood's perspective, how integrated are you compared to the whole community? Well, my research shows that neighborhoods that are whiter than the metropolitan area as a whole are more conservative in terms of their voting process than those that are less white. Neighborhoods that were relatively whiter in 1970, so this is a long time ago, were 42 percentage points less likely to support Obama, right? These are persistent effects. And here we are in my last picture of the comic. Whiter neighborhoods are also more opposed to close racial contact, less likely to view inequality as the product of discrimination, and more likely to oppose open housing laws. In general, our white neighborhoods are more conservative than our residents that have more people, than our neighborhoods that have more residents of color. So I'm gonna end there, and I'd be happy to talk more about all of this in the Q&A or the map to 270 if that's really what you want to talk about.
Wow, Professor Trausting, I'm giving us a round of applause. So much to digest there. And also I was just left with, it really does start at home, right? Like where we live and all those different places. I want to take your class. I want to read the book. The comic was amazing. I want to remind folks, if as you're digesting, to put your questions in the chat, because we're going to get to it after we move on to Dr. Jones, who I'm going to say, take it away and take us to the federal government, I believe, right? Or to Congress.
Yes, yes. So let me see if I can share my screen right now. Hopefully this works. And hopefully that's looking good for you guys. And you can't see my notes. So thank you so much for inviting me for this conversation on equity, justice, and inclusion. Particularly on the eve of this really important and historic election. As Dr. Chalstein sort of mentioned, I will not be able to tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. I also make this the claim that I'm a sociologist. I don't necessarily study voters, but I'm studying how politics is organized as a sort of a social process. So we're looking to this upcoming election and the opportunity to elect candidates who can best address social inequality this year, which is really central to all of our lives. But one thing I sort of mention is that no matter the outcome of tomorrow, no matter who wins the White House or who wins the Senate or the House, that these actors alone will not necessarily produce systemic and transformative change. In order to combat systemic racism and structural inequality, we need to understand the complex and intersecting processes that produce and maintain social inequality in Washington, and the policies that develop from there and govern our social world. So, I would argue that we need to understand who works in Washington. Now, Dean Matos has asked us to understand, or asked me to think about, how does anti-Blackness show up in American politics? As someone who closely follows critical race theory, I would argue that anti-Blackness is a organizing factor of the American political system, right? It's one that helps to develop the political institutions and the policies that emanate from them. And we have sort of seen how in the last 4 years, how the government has continues to perpetuate racial domination. So in my talk, I really want to help us expand the ways in which we think about anti-Blackness and the government, right? I think over the last 4 years, particularly this summer, we've seen a particular lens of what anti-Blackness looks like. And I'm particularly drawn to the idea of violence, right? Violence perpetuated by the state. And we think about violence looking a certain way, right? It's physical violence. And as Hala mentioned in my sort of introduction, I have a different sort of take on what violence looks like, right? So my forthcoming book project is called The Last Plantation. And I can talk more a little bit about this during Q&A, but the idea of the last plantation comes from how Congress is exempt from federal workplace laws. Members of Congress sort of reason within this new era of racial inequality, or sort of this new era committed to anti-discrimination and equal opportunity, that Congress was the last plantation left in this old era. But Black and brown workers who worked in Congress sort of argued that, hey, it's not only this idea of legislative hypocrisy that we should call Congress a plantation, but it is the fact that this is a system that is organized around race, in many ways around violence, right? So in many ways, I want us to expand our ways in which we think about violence, right? In many ways, I think about the coronavirus pandemic as a study of violence in many ways, and the abdication of government responsibility of our government leaders, really in many ways deciding who lives and who dies. To me, that's violent. Debating on healthcare and who gets it, who does not. in many ways, that is a form of violence. So I wanted to expand this a little bit um, more and thinking about that and thinking about not only the rules and regulations and how they can be violent, but how they sort of emanate from political institutions and how that in itself is sort of born of anti-Black violence, right? So in many ways, the way I sort of approach my work is thinking about the sort of seminal quote from Charles Mills in The Racial Contract, which is that white supremacy is a political system. In order to understand how it operates, you need to understand that this is essentially a system run by people, right? So we need to understand who works there, right? In my research, I study how the United States government produces and reinforces racial domination through public policy and the professionals who runs them. Often the way we understand how government perpetuates systemic and structural racism is that we look at policy, right? That we look at the rules, the decision about resources that organize our society along racial lines. However, I also argue that in order to look at another way of looking at policy is looking at who these political professionals, another way of looking at, at policy is looking at who our elected leaders hire, right? These are the people who are in many ways creating public policy, right? And lawmakers' decisions to hire and manage this sort of majority white political workforce is a policy statement in and of itself, right? So in my work, I look at who is working on Capitol Hill within the congressional workplace. That's the sort of the subject of my current book project. But I wanted, during our time today, talk about a new project that I'm working on or in the middle of, and it really looks at the people who are at the bottom of Capitol Hill, interns. So who interns in Congress? I'll say at the sort of the onset, the congressional internships matters for a variety of reasons. In many ways, these work opportunities are an expression of democratic citizenship that support the day-to-day operations of the federal government. They help train and socialize political novices to lawmaking, and they provide a pipeline to paid employment in elective office. So just a few years ago, there was a viral moment from Capitol Hill. On the top, then Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, took this selfie with the Republican class of interns that summer. As you can imagine, this set off a firestorm. As you can see in this class, in this selfie, it's mostly white interns.
Dr. Jones,
a few days later,
Dr. Jones, sorry, pardon the interruption, but I think we're seeing your notes and it's a little harder to see your slides.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Gotcha. Let's just.
But I do remember that selfie. So.
Let's not. Side owning. There we go. How about this? Does that work?
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you.
So we saw this selfie that went viral. There were lots of op-eds thinking about what is the implications of particularly an all-white intern group, particularly who are working for Republicans. A few days later, another selfie went viral. This one shared by Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, and it shows the Democratic cohort of interns that summer. And as you can see, it's much more racially diverse. Many more Black and brown students who are interning on Capitol Hill, right? So there begs the question, who is really on interning on Capitol Hill? Now, all right, sorry, give me 1 second to, now I think it's, give me 1 second. So I developed a project with a group called Pay Our Interns based out of Washington, D.C. This is a group that coincidentally got Congress to pay their interns. So in Congress, in 2018, Congress passed H.R. 6157, which for the first time provided specific funding for lawmakers to pay their interns. It used to be the norm that you would go on Capitol Hill, work a couple weeks, and you would have this great experience, but you would not be paid. And so we really wanted to investigate, well, how effective is this law? Would it increase racial diversity? Would it get to the people that need this funding the most? And surprisingly, we don't know a lot about who interns on Capitol Hill. There isn't any type of institutional or wide record keeping about who interns or on Capitol Hill or in congressional districts, right? And as I'll point out later, this is particularly troubling given that this is an important pipeline to paid positions on Capitol Hill and also to elective offices, right? So there's no question about whether there is whether these sort of work opportunities are properly and or equitably allocated to women, racial minorities, and students from less privileged backgrounds. So along with two students, I went around and surveyed over 106 offices on Capitol Hill. We had a response rate of about 52%. Right? And it's really in many ways helps us for the first time to see who is interning on Capitol Hill. So what did we find? Well, overall, we see that there's an overrepresentation of white students who are interning and that Latino students in particular are dramatically underrepresented. Whites make up about 52% of the undergraduate student population nationally. So this is the population who is most likely going to intern, although it's slightly different. And whites overall make about 73% of House members. However, in our study, they represented about 68% of interns. Latino students, on the other hand, make up about 20% of undergrads nationally. Latinos make up 9% of all House members, but they only made up 5% of the interns in our study. And again, we can sort of see this within the next two charts, right? So thinking is, are House interns as racially diverse as members of Congress? Now, one thing you should know about Congress and the last couple of years is that you'll see this in January too. There will be news headlines about Congress being the most diverse Congress ever, right? And that's pretty much true. That being said, Congress is still not that diverse, but it's getting more diverse in each session, right? So how does the racial diversity that is growing amongst House members compare to who they hire as interns? Here, what we sort of see is that even though there is a growing rate of Latino members in the House, that among House interns, they're dramatically underrepresented, right? So Latino members make up 9% of House members compared to 5% of House interns. And again, you'll sort of see this as a really stark difference when we look at Latino representation under amongst undergrads nationally, right, within this graph, right? So this is another graph that sort of shows the pool of which lawmakers and their staff are hiring from, right? So congressional staff or congressional interns, for all intents and purposes, are they're undergraduate students. There are some notable exceptions for students who are just graduated from college, but also one of the things I think is perhaps even more troubling and telling of how deeply entrenched inequality is in American politics is that a growing number of congressional interns are people who even have graduate degrees. I'll talk in a few moments about one Black woman who was a lawyer, and the only way that she could get on Capitol Hill was to become an intern, right? And so we sort of see here how does House interns, are they as racially diverse as college students nationally wide? And we sort of see partially that is the case. Again, we sort of see that white students are overrepresented in House interns. White students represent 52% of all college students nationwide. However, they make up 67% of House interns in our study. Again, we sort of see this this dramatic underrepresentation with Latino students in particular, where Latino students make up about 20% of the national undergraduate population. However, they only make up about 5% of house interns. We didn't see a statistical difference in the representation of college students nationwide and house interns for Black and Asian students. Now, overall, this sort of begs the question: is Congress really racially diverse, or is it segregated? In part because what we saw was that there were two parties. There was the Republican Party that had mostly white interns, and then there was this more vibrant picture or portrait of diversity amongst House Democrats, that their interns were more racially diverse. Was that true? So again, what I found that the percentage of white interns was 24% higher in the offices of House Republicans than the offices of Democrats, right? White students represented about 85% of the interns who worked for Republicans, compared to 62% of House Democrats. However, if you were to look at those numbers, you would sort of applaud Democrats for their more equitable distribution of, or equitable hiring practices. However, the difference is largely due to the offices of Black, Latino, Asian lawmakers who disproportionately hire interns of their own racial background. So in other words, if you were to compare the offices of white Democrats and white Republicans, statistically speaking, there is no difference. They hire white students at the same rate, and one which is disproportionately higher than average. Now, I want to talk about why this matters, right? In many ways, looking at interns is a way of understanding how inequality operates in American politics and how the congressional workplace is just so unequal. Congressional internships in many ways provide a pipeline to paid employment. They allow these sort of novices to get trained and socialized into how Congress works, and then they get hired on as staffers, right? And congressional staffers are what Malcolm Malvin has termed the invisible force in lawmaking. They construct and implement and realize the political agendas of elected officials. So, when you're watching C-SPAN and you're watching that lawmaker go viral, saying something, particularly tough in a congressional hearing, or even as we witnessed over just the last few weeks during the confirmation of our latest Supreme Court justice, thinking about the questions that were asked. Now, oftentimes, it's not to say that these lawmakers are not involved, but it is to say that a lot of the work that is being done is done behind the scenes. It's done by congressional staffers, right? These are the ones who really propel the work of lawmakers. In many ways, because lawmakers are overwhelmed, and they have an increasing number of responsibilities related to governing, but also towards running for re-election themselves, right? And so these staffers become pretty important. They develop issue expertise, they develop institutional knowledge about how Congress works, and they have this, deep well of social relationships that help them to do work each year they're on Capitol Hill. And as they gain seniority, they gain more influence and they command more power, not only on Capitol Hill, but throughout Washington. So in many ways, Congress acts as this sort of important credentialing institution, right? So it brings people in, it trains them, and then it releases them. It releases them to go work in, the White House, on the Supreme Court. It releases them to go run for office. And so in many ways, we can think about this as it exists not only as a credentialing institution, but the ways in which whites dominate these positions, it's a form of racialized gatekeeping. So in many ways, what Congress is doing is creating a white power elite. Now, I want to sort of talk about why this matters that we have racial representation, right? And so here I have two quotes from two Black women, one Democrat and one Republican. In many ways, they sort of express pretty clearly what I found about why diverse representation is important in these positions. So Keisha, who was a an attorney and a Black Republican, said this. He says, I, as an African American female, have an issue with any piece of legislation that has discriminatory practices in it, on it, around it, and on its face. One of the examples that she sort of cited after saying that was how she blocked her senator, or persuaded her senator, should I say, from signing on from a piece of immigration legislation that would essentially give preferential treatment to white immigrants over non-white immigrants. Deidre worked also as an attorney. She was the person I mentioned who started off as an intern, but who was also a lawyer at the same time, as a way of getting onto Capitol Hill. Now, she specialized in tax policy and healthcare, but she saw it as her job as to sort of steer her lawmaker, who was white, towards the really important needs of his diverse constituency, right? So she says he has a high Hispanic population, and even part of our new district has a decent African American constituency. So my goal has been, and still is, to try to shape his priorities to reflect all of the constituencies, especially those that don't have much of a voice, as some of the other constituencies in our district. In particular, she's talking about a white lawmaker who represented part of Northern California, right? So my argument here is that it's important to have racial representation in these positions, because these staffers facilitate what I call inclusive policymaking. They're often advocating for equity and justice in policymaking, right? And sort of just to distill why this matters a little bit more, thinking about who interns are today and who they will become tomorrow. And in this current Congress, almost 1/5 of all House members have either worked as an intern or as a staffer in Congress prior to being elected, right? And this includes Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, who both interned together in Congress for Senator Daniel Brewster of Maryland. It also matters because this is a pipeline for more diverse representation, right? So here we had a record number of Black women currently serving in Congress. I want to spotlight 2 of them. So on the left, you might recognize Ayanna Pressley, who hails from Boston. Before she became the first Black woman to represent a congressional district in Massachusetts, she was a Congressional Hill staffer for Senator Ted Kennedy. And then on the right is Lauren Underwood. She beat a incumbent in Illinois and became the youngest Black woman ever elected to Congress in 2018. She started off as a congressional intern. Right, so it matters who works on who works on Capitol Hill, in part because this is an important pipeline for women of color and people of color, I would say, overall, right? One of the things I would say about working on Capitol Hill is that it trains you to take on the reins of power. It gives you, it holds a mirror to you to allow you to assess what your political talents are and how you can be of service. Right. And also, you know, we're often sort of thinking about why this matters because, you know, what is going to be the political end? Will an intern become the next Speaker of the House, or will they run for office, or will they become the next Supreme Court Justice? And I think those are all important reasons for thinking about this issue. But it also matters if they don't do any of those things, if they just have that internship. These internships are what I would sort of, or I would say they give you the sort of front seat to history to understand how Congress and other governing institutions work, right? It's this unmatched lesson in democratic lawmaking and this a lesson in democracy in and of itself. So it doesn't matter if they go into politics after they leave their internship, because they're going to carry this this experience with them throughout the rest of their lives. And this is going to be something that they think about and will shape their political identity. I'll say that I interned in Congress as well. Obviously, I am not a member of Congress. However, this had a lasting impact on me and also my family, right? So I think about, the first time I went home as a congressional intern, and, everyone starts thinking, oh, I won't say when my family actually calls me, but they'll say, James is working in Congress. And so they'll ask about Congress as well. But they'll also start to believe and look at this institution a little bit different. Perhaps they'll have a little bit more faith in the institution because now they know that you or someone close has worked in this in this institution. Also, there are so many unexpected career pathways that happen or that develop from working in Congress. So obviously, I'm not going to be someone who's working in Congress, but I've come to be in a position to study this institution, all because I've interned in there. Right, so this should be an opportunity to really be open to everyone. And I'll sort of close with like this slide. And this is my way of trying to be positive about American politics and the inequality that in many ways is entrenched within the American political system, right? So I see in many ways Congress in black and white. It's this place that is dramatically unequal. And as alluding to my book title, it could be The Last Plantation. It's one in which, has low public approval and trust. However, I also see it as a space in which if we have a space of minority empowerment, one in which we have the power to enhance and participate and directly change this institution. So I'm going to stop there. And
thank you so much, Dr. Jones. So my brother too was a congressional staffer on the House and Senate side. So I personally want to thank you for your work, because I know that as the oldest sister who could only take internships that were paid, I really saw it as my family making it when I could support my brother living in my home and paying for all his food and everything, doing that. And also the access it created for him. So I think this is critically important. We would co-conspire, and I do say his internship experience has carried to this day. So the access that we had as a family was also critical. So now I open the floor up to our audience. Amazing presentations by Dr. Jones and Dr. Traunstein. And any questions you all have, if you want to put it in the chat box or raise your hand, and Jacinia is going to help us monitor that. We have about 9 minutes for questions. I don't know if you want to stop sharing your screen, Dr. Jones, and that way I think the gallery view will open up for folks again.
It says I'm stopped.
Okay. I can stop you. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Does anyone have any questions?
We have one in the chat in regards to, as a community members in Merced County, what can we do to encourage diversity and equity in local government? Yes.
I'm not sure this question was directed at me, but I'll start off and then hand it over to Dr. Jones. So one of the things that I like to think about are what are some policy solutions for the kind of segregation patterns that I talked about today. And so I think, this is one place to start, is to advocate for integrated housing in your community and, Merced and everywhere else. But what we really need are neighborhoods with lots of different kinds of housing choices for people at all ends of the income spectrum. And we need desperately in California just a vast increase in the number of houses available, number of homes available, particularly for people at the lower end of the income distribution. So just being an advocate for building more and dense housing in your community is one place you can start, and being attentive to the fact that some neighborhoods are going to be very resistant to that kind of densification, and they're going to use a lot of arguments that don't have to do with race, and you have to understand that the people who benefit most from this kind of system are going to be the ones who are going to fight it the hardest. So you can't be dissuaded by their their obstinance to change.
Thank you.
Well, I would definitely say thinking about equity within who works within local government, right? And making sure that elected officials are held accountable for having a workforce that reflects the diversity of the county.
Thank you both.
Go ahead, Donald. I see your hand. I think you're doing the visual hands. So go ahead. Oh, I can't hear you though. Do you want to put it on the chat?
Oh, his,
Oh, speakers. There we go.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
yes.
Okay, yeah, I didn't have my earphones in. So, you often think about things like, urban development taking over areas that are non-white in big cities like Houston and Detroit. And, you might have read about those, but even in Merced, it's, Merced used to have a Chinatown. You want to know where Chinatown is? It's under Highway 99. That's where they happened to decide to put Highway 99. They just went right over Chinatown. And if you look at the 1940 census of Merced County, which I've studied in depth, and where 99 is in 1940, the wrong side of town and the right side of town were just as clearly divided then as they are now. That south of where 99 is now, which didn't exist then, that's where the Hispanics and the blacks and the poor people lived. North, it was the wealthier people, the tradesmen, shop owners, and so on and so on. So even in a small place like Merced, where you think, well, we think of it as a big city thing, but it happens everywhere, even in smaller towns. A long history. It stays a long time.
All right. We have time for maybe another question or two. Everyone's absorbing everything.
Nobody asked for a map of the Electoral College, so phew.
We have one more question in the chat. How do segregated neighborhoods play into the ways to,
Do it.
yes.
That's good. Good. I planted it myself. So, it plays into it in a couple ways, right? So the neighborhoods that I'm talking about are much smaller than the units that are electing electors in this, in our Electoral College map. But the way that segregation plays a role in this is that there has been a symbiotic relationship for about 50 years now between the maintenance of segregated neighborhoods and the Republican Party. And it started basically with Nixon understanding that this was a population, a community that he could speak to. It wasn't always it wasn't always divided by the parties in this way. But since the 1960s and 70s, and then really taking off in the 80s, there has been a link. And so, one of the things that you will see is the map to 270 is a clunky map, right? So states hide a lot of variation. And when you drill down within states, what you'll see is that at the census tract level or the neighborhood level, you'll see a patterning where whiter communities that are protected by land use laws that create segregation are much more likely to vote for the Republican Party today. So that's the way that they play out. And in California, that's true too, even though California is not going to vote for the Republican Party in the national election, right? So in order to really understand how segregation plays a role in national politics, you have to drill down and see the map at its lowest level.
Sort of just to follow up what Dr. Traustine was saying, I think segregation really has these far-reaching implications. So one of the things I've noticed in my work is that congressmen and congresswomen often say, I will hire whoever looks at my what my district looks like. Well, if your district is segregated, this means that your offices in the congressional workplace is going to be segregated overall as well, right? So one of the things that I found is that sorry, that's my dog now. the wider the congressional district has a direct correlation to the people that they hire. And so in many ways, what you sort of see is that segregation has these sort of far-reaching implications, which in many ways just enhances the agencies of the agency of whites over non-whites. And so it has this really damaging effect of minimizing and constraining the agency and political power of communities of color overall, right? So it has these far-reaching economic, political, and social implications for our society.
So I know we have one last question. It's, of course, everyone's kind of now asking them, and we're right at time. So maybe it's hard to answer in 30 seconds or less. And Sochi, I saw you had one, so maybe I'll ask the panelists to answer that later. But many of my peers and I don't have faith in the government system due to how deeply rooted its institutional racism is, along with all of the other systems set into place to oppress those who are poor and or a person of color. We still choose to exercise our vote and participate in civil action. Will this ever get better? Do you both feel that we have to dismantle many of these systems and start fresh? How do we maintain hope that it will get better when its initial purpose was to benefit some and harm others? That's a lot to unpack, but for those of you who can hang around with us, I'll invite Drs. Trousteing and Jones just to close with this because I think it's a critically important question.
So I want to highlight something that Dr. Jones said in his talk, which is that we do have a more diverse Congress than we once did. The pace of progress is glacial. It is very slow, but it is not impossible to make change. So we have to start by recognizing the systems of inequality, and then we can make the change.
I definitely second that. Recognizing the systems of inequality and how they operate, I think it's going to be really central, right? So, like, again, I think no matter who wins tomorrow, which political party prevails, there's work for us to be done on either side of that. And then I think to the question, how can we have faith in a system that is really rooted in racism? The reason I'm optimistic in part is because, you know, I've been studying this sort of 200-year history of Congress. The reason why I'm optimistic is because I understand the history of Black workers who've been there, and how they have fought and how they've changed things. Yes, this does not mean that racism is gone away. But I think one of the things that's been pretty comforting is how there have been subtle, if not really substantive change because of the people who work inside these institutions. And I think what you're sort of seeing is, you know, there are lots of op-eds, so, you know, how our democracy is dying. But in many ways, if you're looking at the indicators of people who are voting, it's in many ways it's kind of vibrant, although it's kind of broken. And again, you know, this diverse Congress is something to be celebrated. Again, I mentioned Lauren Underwood, and who was the first or the youngest African-American elected in Congress, right? We interned at the same time, right? 15 years ago almost. And like, this is just like, to go from an intern into Congress within a decade is really unheard of. But also, she represents a majority white district, and they voted for her. And so I see these candidates, candidates of color who are winning in non-majority minority districts, and it's quite promising. The trajectory of in which it can go is not to say that it's a linear trajectory, but there is promise, I would say.
I want to thank you, Dr. Jones and Dr. Trousteing, just for lifting us up and giving us so much hope. Fun fact, I was going to run for Congressional 1st District right before saying yes to UC Merced. So you have both planted the seed for me to continue the work on increasing access for people to run. Please don't forget to vote tomorrow if you haven't already. I've been so inspired by all the Twitter posts and all the folks who are engaged in this system that is inherently unequal and systemically racist, as you said. But we have to be the change, right? And we're doing it every single day. You all engage with us here Our next virtual dialogue is on November 17th from 2 to 3 p.m. on COVID-19 with an all-star panel from UC Merced. So join us, tell your friends. Dr. Jones, you're more than welcome to join us again. And again, no matter what happens tomorrow, we will continue. And we will continue on, and we will fight together. And so again, a big round of applause to all of you. And I'm Zoom waiver, so thank you for coming. Have a great afternoon, evening.